Perhaps like you, it was my mother who introduced me to stories at a young age, and I'm very grateful to her for that. It was my first primary school teachers who read us chapter books, and they were the highlight of our school day. We were excited to see what was the next story in the chapter. In high school, I was introduced to the genre of short stories. And since that time, I have constantly looked out for that next enthralling great story. I know in our Maori heritage, that story is central. It is so important to who we are. And so today, as we continue with our Christmas Mixtape series, I just wanted to share with you a short story that I have found to be an incredible story. The author is also the author of a Christmas hymn that we know quite well, Joyful, Joyful, We Adore You. And his name is Henry Van Dyke. The story is one of the great classics. It's along the lines of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And Henry wrote the story some 120 years ago. It's entitled The Other Wise Man, and it tells the story of a fourth wise man who, like we heard as the boys read to us this morning in the story of the Bible, who went on a journey to find Jesus and to come and to worship him. But it has a different storyline to that one that we have heard previously. The year after he wrote the story, the author said this. He said, "I do not know where this little story came from, out of thin air perhaps, but one thing is certain. It is not written in any other book, nor is it to be found among the ancient lore of the East, and yet I have never felt as if it was my own. It was a gift, and it seemed to me that I knew the giver." And so here it is. In the days of Caesar Augustus, when he was master of many kings, and Herod the Great reigned in Jerusalem, there lived in the city of Ecbatana, among the mountains of Persia, a certain man named Artaban the Mede. He was a tall, dark man of about 40 years, with brilliant eyes set near together under his broad brow. A man of sensitive feeling, but inflexible will. One of those who, in whatever age they live, are born for inward conflict and a life of quest. His robe was of pure white wool, thrown over a tunic of silk and a white pointed cap, with long lapels at his side, which rested on his flowing black hair. It was the dress of the ancient priesthood of the Magi, called the fire worshippers. Artaban spoke, "It has been shown to me and to my 3 companions among the Magi. We have searched the ancient tablets of Chaldea and computed the time. It falls in this year. We have studied the sky, and in the spring of the year we saw 2 of the greatest stars draw together in the sign of the fish, which is of the house of the Hebrews. We also saw a new star there, which shone for one night, and then it vanished. Now again, the 2 great planets are meeting. This night is their conjunction. My 3 brothers are watching at the ancient temple of the 7 spheres in Borsippa in Babylonia, and I am watching here. If the star shines again, they will wait 10 days for me at the temple, and then we will set out together for Jerusalem to see and to worship the promised one who shall be born King of Israel. I believe that the sign will come. I have made ready for the journey. I have sold my house and all my possessions, and have brought these 3 jewels, a sapphire, a ruby, and a pearl, to carry them as tribute for the king." While he was speaking, he thrust his hand into his inmost fold of his girdle, and he drew out the 3 great gems. One was as blue as the fragment of the night sky, the other redder than a ray of sunrise, and one as pure as the peak of a snow mountain at twilight. And he laid them on the outspread linen scrolls before him. He then gathered up the jewels, and he replaced them in his girdle. For a long time he stood and he watched the flame that flickered and sank upon the altar. And then he crossed the hall. He lifted the heavy curtain and he passed out between the dull red pillars of porphyry to the terrace on the roof. Far over the eastern plain, a white mist stretched out like a lake. But where the distant peak of Zagros serrated the western horizon, the sky was clear. Jupiter and Saturn rolled together like drops of lambent flame, about to blend together as one. As Artaban watched them, behold, an azure spark was born out of the darkness beneath, rounding itself with purple splendors to a crimson sphere, and spiraling upward into a point of white radiance. As Artaban, tiny and infinitely remote, yet perfect in every part, it pulsated in the enormous vault as if the 3 jewels in the Magian's chest had mingled and been transformed into a living heart of light. He bowed his head. He covered his brow with his hands. "It is the sign," he said. "The king is coming, and I am going to meet him." All night long, Vasda, the swiftest of Artaban's horses, had been waiting, saddled and bridled, in her stall, pawing the ground impatiently and shaking her bit as if she shared the eagerness of her master's purpose, though she knew not its meaning. And before the white mist had started to lift lazily from the plain, the other wise man was in his saddle, riding swiftly along the high road which led westward. Through the keen morning air, the swift hooves beat their spirited music along the road, keeping time to the pulsing of 2 hearts that moved together towards the same goal, to conquer space, to devour the distance, to attain the goal of the journey. Artaban must indeed ride wisely and well if he would keep the appointed hour with the other magi, for the route was 150 parasangs, and 15 was the utmost that he could accomplish in one day. But he knew Vasda's strength, and he pushed forward without anxiety, making the fixed distance every day, though he knew he must travel late into the night and in the morning long before sunrise. Artaban pressed onwards until he arrived at nightfall of the 10th day beneath the shattered walls of Babylon. Vasda was almost spent, and he would gladly have turned into the city to find rest and refreshment for himself and for her. But he knew that it was 3 hours' journey to the temple of the 7 spheres, and that he must reach the place by midnight if he were to find his comrades waiting. So he did not halt, but he rode steadily across the stubble fields. And then a grove of date palms made an island of gloom in the pale yellow sea. As she passed into the shadow, Vasda slackened her pace and began to pick her way more carefully. Near the farther end of the darkness, an access of caution seemed to fall upon her. She scented some danger or difficulty. It was not in her heart to fly from it, only to be prepared for it and to meet it wisely, as any good horse should do. At last she gave a quick breath of anxiety and dismay and stood stock still, quivering in every muscle before a dark object in the shadow of the last palm tree. Artaban dismounted. The dim starlight revealed the form of a man lying across the road. His humble dress and the outline of his haggard face showed that he was probably one of the poor Hebrew exiles who still dwelt in great numbers in that vicinity. His pallid skin, dry and as yellow as parchment, bore the mark of the deadly fever which ravaged the marshlands in autumn. The chill of death was in his lean hand, and as Artaban released it, the arm fell back inertly upon the motionless form. He turned away with a thought of pity, consigning the body to that strange burial which the Magians deemed most fitting, the funeral of the desert, from which the kites and vultures rise on dark wings, and the beasts of prey slink furtively away, leaving only a heap of white bones in the desert. But as he turned, a long, faint, ghostly sigh came from the man's lips. The brown, bony fingers closed convulsively on the hem of the Magian's robe and held him fast. Artaban's heart leaped to his throat, not with fear, but with a dumb resentment at the importunity of this blind delay. How could he stay there in the darkness to minister to a dying stranger? What claim had this unknown fragment of human life upon his compassion or his service? If he lingered here but for an hour, he would hardly reach Borsippa at the appointed time. His companions would think he had given up the journey. They would go without him. He would lose his quest. But if he went on now, the man would surely die. If he stayed, perhaps life could be restored. His spirit throbbed and fluttered with the urgency of the crisis. Should he risk the great reward of his divine faith for the sake of a single deed of human love? Should he turn aside, if only for a moment, from the following of the star to give a cup of cold water to a poor, perishing Jew? God of truth and purity, he prayed, direct me in the holy path, the way of wisdom, which only you know. Then he turned back to the sick man. Loosening the grasp of his hand, he carried him to a little mound at the foot of the palm tree. He unbound the thick folds of his turban, and he opened the garment above his sunken chest. He brought water from one of the small canals nearby, and he moistened the sufferer's brow and his mouth. He mingled a draught of one of those simple, potent remedies which he always carried in his girdle, and he poured it slowly between the colourless lips. Hour after hour, he laboured as only a skillful healer of disease can do, and at last the man's strength returned. He sat up and he looked around him. "Who are you?" he said, in the rude dialect of his country. "Why have you found me here and brought me back to life?" "I am Artaban, the Magian, of the city of Ecbatana, and I'm going to Jerusalem in search of one who is to be born King of the Jews, a great prince and deliverer of all men. I dare not delay any longer upon my journey, for the caravan that has waited for me will depart without me. But see, here is the little left of the bread and the wine, and here is a potion of healing herbs. when your strength is restored, you can find the dwellings of the Hebrews among the houses of Babylon. The Jew raised his trembling hands solemnly to heaven. Now may the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob bless and prosper the journey of the merciful, and bring him in peace to his desired haven. But I have nothing to give you in return, only this, that I can tell you where the Messiah is to be found. For our prophets have said that he should not be born in Jerusalem, but in Bethlehem of Judah. May the Lord bring you in safety to that place, because you have had pity on the sick. It was already long past midnight. Artaban rode in haste, and Vasda, restored by his brief rest, ran eagerly through the silent plain and swam the channels of the river. She put forth the remnant of her strength and fled over the ground like a gazelle. But the first beam of the sun sent her shadow before her as she entered upon the final stadium of the journey. And the eyes of Artaban, anxiously scanning the great mound of Nimrod and the temple of the seven spheres, could discern no trace of his friends. Artaban rode swiftly around the hill. He dismounted and climbed to the highest terrace, looking out towards the west. The huge desolation of the marshes stretched away to the horizon and the border of the desert, but there was no sign of the caravan of the wise man, neither far nor near. At the edge of the terrace, he saw a little cairn of broken rocks, and under them was a piece of parchment. He caught it up and read, "We have waited past the midnight, and we can delay no longer. We go to find the king. Follow us across the desert." Artaban sat down upon the ground and covered his head in despair. "How can I cross the desert," said he, "with no food and with a spent horse? I must return to Babylon. I will sell my sapphire and buy a train of camels and provisions for the journey. I may never find my friends. Only God the merciful knows whether I will not lose the sight of the king because I tarried to show mercy." There was silence in the Hall of Dreams, where I was listening to the story of the other wise man. And through the silence, I saw, but very dimly, his figure passing over the dreary undulations of the desert, high upon the back of his camel, rocking steadily onward like a ship on the waves. Through heat and cold, the Magian moved steadily onward. I followed the figure of Artaban until he arrived at Bethlehem, and it was the third day after the three wise men had come to this place and had found Mary and Joseph with the young child Jesus, and had lain their gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Then the other wise man drew near, weary but full of hope, bearing his ruby and his pearl to offer to the king. "For now at last," he said, "I shall surely find him, though it be alone, and later than my brothers." The streets of the village seemed to be deserted, and Artaban wondered whether the men had gone up to the hill pastures to bring down their sheep. From the open door of a low stone cottage, he heard the sound of a woman's voice singing softly. He entered and found a young mother hushing her baby to sleep. She told him of the strangers from the Far East who had appeared in the village just 3 days ago, and how they had said that a star was guiding them to the place where Joseph of Nazareth was lodging with his wife and her newborn child, and how they had paid reverence to the child and given him many rich gifts. But the travellers disappeared again, she continued, as suddenly as they had come. The man of Nazareth took the babe and his mother, and they fled away that same night secretly, and it was whispered that they were going far away to Egypt. Artaban listened to her gentle, timid speech, and the child in her arms looked up in his face and smiled, stretching out its rosy hands to grasp at the winged circle of gold on his chest. His heart warmed to the touch. It seemed like a greeting of love and trust to the one who had journeyed along in loneliness and perplexity, fighting his own doubts and fears and following a light that was veiled in clouds. Might not this child have been the promised prince, he asked within himself as he touched its soft cheek? Kings have been born ere now in lowlier houses than this, and the favourite of the stars may rise even from a cottage. But it has not seemed good to the God of wisdom to reward my search so soon and so easily. The one whom I seek has gone before me, and now I must follow the king to Egypt. The young mother laid the babe in its cradle and rose to minister to the wants of the strange guest that fate had brought into her house. She set food before him, the plain fare of peasants, but willingly offered, and therefore full of refreshment to the soul as well as the body. Artaban accepted it gratefully, and as he ate, the child fell into a happy slumber and murmured sweetly in its dreams, and a great peace filled the quiet room. But suddenly there came the noise of a wild confusion and uproar in the streets of the village, a shrieking and wailing of women's voices, a clangor of brazen trumpets and a clashing of swords, and a desperate cry. The soldiers of Herod, they are killing our children. The young mother's face grew white with terror. She clasped her child tightly and crouched motionless in the darkest corner of the room, covering him with the folds of her robe, lest he should wake and cry. But Artaban went quickly and stood in the doorway of the house. His broad shoulders filled the portal from side to side, and the peak of his white cap but touched the lintel. The soldiers came hurrying down the street with bloody hands and dripping swords. At the sight of the stranger in his imposing dress, they hesitated with surprise. The captain of the band approached the threshold to thrust him aside, but Artaban did not stir. His face was as calm as though he were watching the stars. He held the soldier silently for an instant, and then he said in a low voice, "I am all alone in this place, and I am waiting to give this jewel to the prudent captain who will leave me in peace." He showed the ruby, glistening in the hollow of his hand like a great drop of blood. The captain was amazed at the splendor of the gem. The pupils of his eyes expanded with desire, and the hard lines of greed wrinkled around his lips. He stretched out his hand. He took the ruby. "March on," he cried to his men. "There is no child here. The house is still." The clamour and the clang of arms passed down the street as Artaban re-entered the cottage. He turned his face to the east and he prayed, "God of truth, forgive my sin. I have said the thing that is not to save the life of a child, and 2 of my gifts are now gone. I have spent for man that which was meant for God. Shall I ever be worthy to see the face of the King?" But the voice of the woman, weeping for joy in the shadow behind him, said very gently, "Because you have saved the life of my little one, may the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you and give you peace." Then again, there was silence in the hall of dreams, deeper and more mysterious than the first interval. And I understood that the years of Artaban were flowing very swiftly under the stillness of that clinging fog. And I caught only a glimpse, here and there, of the river of his life, shining through the shadows that concealed its course. I saw him moving among the throngs of men in populous Egypt, seeking everywhere for traces of the household that had come down from Bethlehem. I saw him again at the foot of the pyramids as he looked up into the vast countenance of the crouching Sphinx. I saw him again in an obscure house in Alexandria, taking counsel with a Hebrew rabbi. The venerable man read aloud the pathetic words which foretold the sufferings of the promised Messiah, the despised and rejected of men, the man of sorrows and the acquaintance with grief. "And remember, my son," said he, fixing his deep-set eyes upon the face of Artaban, "the king whom you are seeking is not to be found in a palace, nor among the rich and the powerful. If the light of the world and the glory of Israel had been appointed to come with the greatness of earthly splendor, it would have appeared long before now. But the light for which the world is waiting is a new light, the glory that will rise out of patient and triumphant suffering. And the kingdom which is to be established forever is a new kind of kingdom, the royalty of perfect and unconquerable love." So I saw the other wise man again and again, traveling from place to place and searching among the people of the great dispersion, with whom the little family from Bethlehem might perhaps have found a refuge. He passed through countries where famine lay heavy on the land and the people were crying out for bread. He made his dwelling in plague-stricken cities where the sick were languishing in the bitter companionship of helpless misery. He visited the oppressed and the afflicted in the gloom of subterranean prisons and the crowded wretchedness of slave markets and the weary toil of galley ships. In all this populous and intricate world of anguish, though he found none to worship, he found many to help. He fed the hungry, he clothed the naked, he healed the sick, and he comforted the captive. And as years went by more swiftly than the weaver's shuttle that flashes back and forth through the loom, while the web grows and the invisible pattern is completed. It seemed almost as if he had forgotten his quest. But once I saw him for a moment as he stood alone at sunrise, waiting at the gate of a Roman prison. He had taken from a secret resting place near to his heart the pearl, the last of his treasures. As he looked at it, a mellower luster, a soft and iridescent light, full of shifting gleams of azure and rose, trembled upon its surface. It seemed to have absorbed some of the reflection of the colors of the lost sapphire and ruby. So the profound, secret purpose of a noble life draws into itself the memories of past joy and of past sorrow. It becomes more luminous and precious the longer it is carried close to the warmth of the beating heart. And then at last, while I was thinking of this pearl and of its meaning, I heard the end of the story of the other wise man. 33 years of the life of Artaban had passed away, and he was still a pilgrim and a seeker after light. His hair, once darker than the cliffs of Zagros, was now white as the wintry snow that covered them. His eyes, that once flashed like flames of fire, were as dull as embers smouldering among the ashes. worn and weary and ready to die, but still looking for the king, he had come for the last time to the city of Jerusalem. He'd often visited the holy city before and had searched through all its lanes and crowded hovels and black prisons without finding any trace of the family of the Nazarenes who had fled from Bethlehem so long ago. But now it seemed as if he must make one more effort, and something whispered in his heart that at last he might succeed. It was the season of the Passover. The city was thronged with strangers. The children of Israel, scattered in far lands all over the world, had returned to the temple for the great feast, and there had been a confusion of tongues in the narrow streets for many days. But on this day there was a singular agitation visible in the multitude. The sky was veiled with portentous gloom, and currents of excitement seemed to flash through the crowd like the thrill which shakes the forest on the eve of a storm. A secret tide was sweeping them all away. The clatter of sandals and the soft, thick sand of thousands of bare feet shuffling over the stones, flowing unceasingly along the street that leads to the Damascus gate. Artaban joined company with a group of people from his own country, Parthian Jews who had come to keep the Passover, and inquired of them the cause of the tumult and where they were planning to go. "We are going," they answered, "to a place called Golgotha, outside the city walls, where there is to be an execution. Have you not heard what has happened? 2 famous robbers are to be crucified, and with them another. His name is Jesus of Nazareth, a man who has done many wonderful works among the people, such that they love him greatly. But the priests and elders have said that he must die, because he gave himself to be the Son of God. And so Pilate has sent him to the cross, because he said that he was the King of the Jews." How strangely these familiar words fell upon the tired heart of Artaban. They had led him for a lifetime over land and sea, and now they came to him darkly and mysteriously, like a message of despair. The king had arisen, but he had been denied and cast out. Could it be the same who had been born in Bethlehem 33 years ago, at whose birth the star had appeared in heaven and whose coming the prophets had spoken of? Artaban's heart beat unsteadily with that troubled, doubtful apprehension which is the excitement of old age. But he said within himself, "The ways of God are stranger than the thoughts of men, and it may yet be that I would find the king at last in the hands of his enemies, and shall come in time to offer my pearl as a ransom before he dies." And so the old man followed the multitude with slow and painful steps towards the Damascus gate of the city. Just beyond the entrance of the guardhouse, a troop of Macedonian soldiers came into the street, dragging a young girl with a torn dress and dishevelled hair. She broke suddenly from the hands of her tormentors and threw herself at his feet, clasping him around the knees. "Have pity on me," she cried, "and save me, for the sake of the God of purity. I also am a daughter of the true religion which is taught by the Magi. My father was a merchant in Parthia, but he is dead, and I am seized for his debts to be sold as a slave. Save me from worse than death." Artaban trembled. It was the old conflict in his soul which had come to him in the palm grove of Babylon and in the cottage at Bethlehem. The conflict between the expectation of faith and the impulse of love. Twice the gift which he had consecrated to the worship of religion had been drawn from his hand to the service of humanity. This was his third trial, the ultimate probation, the final and irrevocable choice. Was it his great opportunity, or was it his last temptation? He could not tell. One thing only was clear in the darkness of his mind. It was inevitable, and does not the inevitable come from God? One thing only was sure to his divided heart. To rescue this helpless girl would be a true deed of love. And is not love the light of the soul? He took the pearl from his heart. Never had it seemed so luminous, so radiant, so full of tender living luster. He laid it in the hand of the slave. This is thy ransom, daughter. It is the last of my treasures, which I kept for the king. When he spoke, the darkness of the sky thickened, and shuddering tremors ran through the earth, heaving convulsively like the chest of one who struggles with a mighty grief. The walls of the houses rocked to and fro. Stones were loosened and crashed into the street. Dust clouds filled the air. The soldiers fled in terror, reeling like drunken men. But Artaban and the girl whom he had ransomed crouched helpless beneath the wall of the praetorium. What had he to fear? What had he to live for? He had given away the last remnant of his tribute for the king. He had parted with the last hope of finding him. The quest was over, and it had failed. But even in that thought, accepted and embraced, there was a peace. It was not resignation. It was not submission. It was something more profound and searching. He knew that all was well because he had done the best that he could from day to day. He had been true to the light that had been given to him. He had looked for more. And if he had not found it, if a failure was all that came out of his life, doubtless that was the best that was possible. He had seen the revelation of life everlasting, incorruptible and immortal. But he knew that even if he could live his earthly life again, it could not be otherwise than it had been. One more lingering pulsation of the earthquake quivered through the ground. A heavy tile, shaken from the roof, fell and struck the old man on the temple. He lay breathless and pale, with his grey head resting on the young girl's shoulder and blood trickling from the wound. As she bent over him, fearing that he was dead, there came a voice through the twilight, very small and still, like music sounding from a distance, in which the notes are clear, but the words are lost. The girl turned to see if someone had spoken from the window above them, but she saw no one. And then the old man's lips began to move, as if in answer, and she heard him say in the Parthian tongue, "Not so, my lord. For when saw I thee and hungered and fed you, or thirsty and gave you drink? When saw I thee a stranger and took you in, or naked and clothed you? When saw I thee sick or in prison and came unto you? 33 years have I looked for you, but I have never seen your face, nor ministered to you, my king." He ceased, and the sweet voice came yet again, and again the young girl heard it, very faintly and far away. But now it seemed as though she understood the words, "Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you have done it to one of the least of these my children, you have done it unto me." A calm radiance of wonder and joy lighted the pale face of Artaban like the first ray of dawn on a snowy mountain peak. One long last breath of relief exhaled gently from his lips. His journey was ended. His treasures were accepted. The other wise man had found the king. Let's pray. Lord God, as we come to this time of the year, I pray that we would truly know what it means to come and adore you. That it is in looking around us, it is seeing the people among us, and it is loving and caring and helping and being kind. Lord, I pray that that would be the purpose of every single one of us as we go into this Christmas season. I pray in your name.